Welcome everyone! They often say all rook and pawn endgames are drawn, but you still gotta know what you're doing. For today I've therefore picked a very common rook and pawn endgame. It's so common in fact that this may actually be the most important endgame of all, and I'll show you two ways to draw. Now, as you can see in this first example, white is up a pawn and both sides have a rook. We'll be looking from the defender's point of view because this is indeed a very simple draw. Once I've explained what the drawing mechanism is, I'll show a similar position that is also drawn, but where you have to use another technique. Anyway, let's cover this position first. One very important thing has already happened, and that is that the king is in front of the enemy pawn. That is essential, otherwise this technique will not work. It's black to move, and let me first show you how black should not play. Black could go rook to g1. Now this move doesn't lose, but black is about to do something that's very common in club level play, and after that he is losing. Now of course white wants to promote the pawn, he goes king to d6. Now white has a clear threat, he wants to go rook a8 check, and after king to f7 just advance the e-pawn and white would be winning. And now what happens a lot at club level is that they give a check. But that is a losing move. Now white goes king to e6, now white is even threatening checkmate with rook to a8. If black tries rook to d8 to cover against the check, then simply rook to h7, checkmate is threatened again, black can only run away with the king, but then he just loses the rook and the game. And if instead king to f8, then again check, and after king to g7, king to e7, the white king just advances and white will promote the pawn. So that's how you should not play. Going back to the starting position, you could make it easy on yourself and just use this very simple procedure, and then it's just not possible to blunder the game away. Black should just go rook to g6. Now the rook cuts off the king on the 6th rank, therefore white will never go king to e6 and white won't win. This position is very famous, it's called the Philidor position, and already in the 18th century they knew this was a draw. White really cannot do anything now, giving checks does absolutely nothing. In fact, now it's even easier because now the king also keeps the white king out. And if another check, the king just goes back and white didn't gain anything. And if white instead tries e6, just advancing the pawn, then it gets even easier. We drop the rook back, and after king to d6, there's a checkmate threat again, but it doesn't matter. We just check and just keep checking forever, and it's gonna be a draw. Well, so far so good. Many of you maybe knew this already, but let's now check a slightly different position. Here is position number 2. You can see it's very similar, but there's one key difference. It is not possible for black to get the Philidor position. Black would like to play rook to f6 to cut off the king on the 6th rank, but that's not possible right now because the pawn is covering f6. However, it's still a draw, and the trick is to now put the rook behind the pawn, so rook to f1. Now watch what happens. White advances the king. As we've just seen, we should not go rook d1 check because of king to e6, and we just saw that white is winning here. Instead, black puts a rook behind the pawn, and you'll see that white won't be able to advance the pawn any further. This is called the Kling and Horwitz defensive technique. Let's check out white's options. Of course, e6 does nothing, because as in the Philidor position, we just check. And if the king tries to escape the checks, we just attack the pawn. So the king has to come back. We check again, and it's gonna be a draw. White's best try is king to e6. The threat is now checkmate, and here it's always best to move the king to the short side of the pawn, because then the rook can always give checks on the long side if necessary, and then the rook will have the right checking distance. Now white tries the check anyway. King to g7, that also attacks the rook, so let's say rook to a8. And now black just makes a waiting move. It's easiest to just wait with the rook, so rook to e2. And now watch, here's the trick. If white now goes king to d6, making room for the pawn to advance, then we just go king to f7, and now the king also helps prevent the pawn advance. That's why it was important to put the rook behind the pawn, because combined with the king, black just covers the e6 square and the pawn cannot move. White can do nothing to make progress. He can try, of course, let's say he gets a check. Now the king just goes back to e8. Rook e7 check also doesn't help. After king to f8, white needs to move the rook again, because it's blocking the pawn now. But after, for example, rook to d7, we can simply move the king back to e8. But we can also just wait with the rook again, so let's say rook to e1. There's really nothing to do for white. If now e6, that doesn't help. Now we check. If here king to c7, then simply rook to e1 and white cannot advance the pawn. And if instead king to e5, then we can trade rooks and go king to e7. The king mops up the pawn, and as promised, it's a draw. So those are two very important endgames to know, the Philidor position and the Kling and Horwitz defense. It's very easy once you know the reasoning behind it. To check if you really understand, I think it's very useful to play the position against an engine and to let the engine try to beat you. Let me know in the comments if you tried that and how you did. If you learned something, please like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. And it also lets me know if you want me to show you more endgames. I'll see you guys again soon, and take care.